The chamber was so large that the far wall disappeared into a soft haze. Not fog, just distance. The Galactic Security Council met in a room built to make every species feel small, and for most species it worked. 4,217 species had sat in those curved seats and felt the ceiling press down on them like a thumb. Dehyun had stopped feeling it years ago. He sat in the human observation tier, 3 seats, slightly raised, slightly off to the side like an afterthought bolted to the main structure, and watched the session run through its 3rd hour. The air near him was filtered to human breathable levels. It tasted faintly of recycled metal, the way all council air did. He had stopped noticing that too. Bora sat 1 seat to his left. She had a writing tablet on her knee and had been recording the session in longhand since it started. Not because the council didn't have automated transcription. It did. She wrote by hand because she did not trust machines to record tone. She had worked for Dehyun for 4 years. She had learned that tone was where everything real lived. Up at the main floor, High Arbiter Veldorn was receiving the casualty report from the Keth 7 corridor. The Drovan Empire had pushed 3 engagement lines in 11 days. The Council's allied defense forces, a mix of Kethian garrison troops and Valgorath forward units, had collapsed in each one. The numbers were not good. Veldorn listened to them with the patience of a being that had chaired 400 sessions and heard bad numbers before. 7 of its limbs were folded neatly under it. The other 2 cleaned each other in slow, methodical strokes. It was not distracted. That was just what Valgorath bodies did when they were thinking. Delegate Sarath of the Kethian Alliance spoke next. Its skin cycled through 3 shades of pale blue as it spoke, a bioluminescent species, feelings written in light whether it wanted them to be or not. It described the situation in the Keth 7 corridor as it stood. It used careful words, diplomatic words, but its skin kept going blue, blue, darker blue, and Bora wrote that down too. Then the clerk read the petition. It was a minor agenda item. It came between a trade dispute and a request for medical supply rerouting. The clerk read it in a flat, administrative tone, the kind of voice built for things that don't matter. The first human expeditionary force, comprising 4,200 volunteer soldiers, formally requests authorization to deploy to the Keth 7 corridor in support of Council-aligned defense operations. The room was quiet for exactly 1 beat. Then Veldorn made a sound. It started low in its chest, or what passed for a chest, and came out somewhere between a rumble and a whistle, the Valgorath equivalent of a laugh. The delegates nearest to it caught it first, the way a spark catches dry grass, one then the next then the next. By the time it reached the outer tiers, it was open, full, and not unkind. Warm, almost, the way you laugh at a child who says something confident and wrong. Bora's pen did not stop moving. Delegate Sarath's skin went a color Dehyun had not seen before. He filed it away. He was good at filing things away. A Valgorath representative, not Veldorn, a junior delegate in the 2nd tier, pulled up the human species file on the display. Standard Council taxonomy. It read the relevant fields allowed for the room. No natural armor, no regenerative cell structures, no venom, no psionic capacity above baseline. Bone density rated at what the file called * critical fragility threshold. Lifespan short. Recovery from physical trauma, slow. Pain tolerance, moderate. The junior delegate paused on that last one, moderate, as if it found this the most baffling entry of all. The room found this funny too. Dehyun looked at the display. The human file had a photo. The standard council contact image, a single human in neutral lighting, neutral clothing standing straight. The photo was 12 years old. The human in it was not smiling. Dehyun had submitted that photo himself. Veldorn, still warm with its own amusement, gestured toward the human observation tier. A courtesy. 90 seconds of floor time. The standard offering for observer species on minor agenda items. Dehyun stood. He did not use notes. He had not brought any. He looked at the room, the 231 delegates, the species that breathed methane and the ones that breathed nothing at all, the ones with eyes and the ones with other things instead, and he said, plainly and without drama, "We would like to remind the Council that our casualty tolerance is a separate metric from our combat effectiveness." Silence. One beat. Then more laughter, warmer than the first round. The kind that comes with something like affection attached. The humans were strange little things, endearing in their way. The ambassador was so serious about it. Look at him standing up there, this soft-boned biped who lived 80 years if the planet was kind to him, asking to be taken seriously on a battlefield that had broken Valgorath plating in 11 days. Dehyun sat back down. Bora had written the full sentence, then underlined it twice, then stopped writing and looked at her tablet for a moment before she started again. The vote passed 14-2, authorization granted. The Keth 7 corridor was considered a lost zone by every tactical model the Council ran. The human force would serve as a buffer, a delay, while real response options were assembled. Nobody said that part aloud. They didn't need to. The math was visible to everyone in the room, including the humans. Especially the humans. The session moved on to the trade dispute. The chamber refilled with the sounds of normal business. Species argued about mineral rights in a system 3 sectors away. Bora kept writing. Veldorn cleaned 2 more limbs. Dehyun stayed in his seat when the other observers left for the break. He pulled out a small device from his coat pocket and set it on his knee. A live feed. The connection took a moment to find signal through the chamber's shielding, then cleared. On the screen, the interior of a transport vessel, not clean, lived in, the kind of ship that had been used hard and not apologized for it. Maps spread across a folding table. 3 people leaning over them, talking low, pointing at things that meant something specific to people who had been thinking about this for days. At the center of the table stood Junho. He was looking at the map the way a person looks at something they have already decided about, not studying it, confirming it. His finger traced a line, one specific line, and he said something to the person beside him that the audio picked up only as a murmur. Dehyun watched for a moment. Outside in the corridor, delegates laughed at something unrelated. The sound came through the chamber doors muffled and soft. Dehyun closed the feed. He put the device back in his coat pocket and sat with his hands folded in his lap, looking at the spot on the main display where the human file had been shown. It was gone now, replaced by the trade disputes mineral maps. Another system, another problem. The Council moved on, the way the Council always moved on, certain that it had already calculated every relevant variable. Bora looked at him. He did not look back at her. She turned to a new page in her tablet and kept writing. The session ran another 2 hours. Nothing significant happened. Outside, somewhere in the dark between stars, 4,200 humans finished loading their equipment onto transports and began moving toward a corridor the galaxy had already written off. Nobody laughed about that part. It had not happened yet. The Kethian soldiers placed their bet before the transports even finished docking. 4 of them stood near the outpost's East Bay, the only part of the structure still fully intact after the second Drovan push, and watched the human ship settle into the landing cradles. One of the 4 held out a closed fist. The others read the bet. 2 ration packs said the humans would request evacuation within 6 hours of arrival. The other 3 took the bet. Not because they thought the humans would stay. Because 6 hours seemed generous. The transports opened. The humans came out in groups, moving with the kind of organized quiet that serious people move with when they are somewhere new and want to understand it before they speak about it. They carried equipment, a lot of it, crates and cases and long-wrapped shapes that had no obvious name. The Kethian soldiers watched the unloading and tried to count the pieces and gave up somewhere around the 8th crate. Junho came out last. He stopped at the bottom of the ramp and stood still for a moment, not frozen, not impressed. just pausing in the specific way that a person pauses when they are memorizing the layout of somewhere they intend to use. His eyes moved across the outpost, the damaged wall on the north side, the sight lines from the ridge above, the gap between the two remaining perimeter towers. He looked at the gap for a little longer than everything else. Then he picked up his bag and walked toward the command structure like he had been here before. The Kethian garrison commander met him inside. Commander Reth, a senior officer, one of 7 surviving members of the original 42 who had held this position through 3 Drovan engagements. He had skin like old stone and eyes that had stopped looking surprised at things several weeks ago. He showed Junho the maps. He explained the Drovan attack patterns. He gave the numbers, force estimates, movement speed, the cycle of pushes and pauses that the Drovan used. Junho listened. He did not write anything down. He looked at the maps the way Dihyun had watched him look at the maps on the transport, confirming, not learning, as if he had already been here in his head for days and was just matching the real place to the one he had built inside it. He asked about the pauses. Not the attacks, the pauses between them. How long did the Drovan rest between each push? Did it vary? What determined the length? Was it supply-based, command-based, something to do with the terrain? Reth answered each question slowly, the way you answer a person who is asking the right thing for the wrong reasons, or what you assume are the wrong reasons. When Junho finished asking, he nodded once and said he would need the full terrain records for a 12-kilometer radius. Reth said he would have them sent over. Junho thanked him. He meant it, which for some reason made it stranger. Across the outpost, Tiho had set up in one of the storage bays. He had unpacked 3 crates himself and was assembling something on the floor with the focused gentleness of a very large person who has learned over time that careful hands matter more than strong ones. A Kethian observer, young, not a soldier but a logistics officer assigned to support the incoming unit, stood in the bay doorway watching. The thing Tiho was assembling did not match anything in the Kethian observer's experience. It had the rough shape of a weapon, but the texture of something built for permanence, the kind of build quality that says this will be used many times, not just once. The observer asked what it was. Tiho told him, 3 words, specific words. The observer ran them through his translation matrix. The matrix returned 3 possible interpretations. The observer looked at each one. He picked the least alarming interpretation and decided that was probably the correct one. It was not the correct one. Tiho finished the assembly, stood, and tested the mechanism once. The sound it made was brief and final, like a door being closed in an empty building. In the communications bay, Yuna and Minyu were arguing. This was normal. The Kethian signals officer who had been assigned to help them integrate systems stood in the corner and watched them argue about frequency calibration with the expression of someone watching a sport they do not understand, but are fairly certain is not actually about the frequency calibration. They spoke over each other, finished each other's sentences, contradicted those sentences, agreed with the contradictions, and produced a working system configuration in 40 minutes that the Kethian officer's own team had estimated would take most of a day. Minyu caught the officer staring. He grinned. The grin was too wide for the room and too easy for the situation and somehow exactly right for both. He said, "It always looks worse than it is." The Kethian officer was not sure this was true. He decided to believe it anyway. Nari was at the perimeter. She had been at the perimeter for an hour before anyone noticed she was there at all. She stood very still at the eastern edge of the outpost, just inside the sensor boundary, and she was drawing. Not scanning, not recording, drawing. On paper with a pen, the kind of low-tech tool that no one in the Council's Alliance database had flagged as a military instrument. Her notebook was small. Her lines were quick and exact. She drew the ridge, the gap in the tree cover, the angle of approach from the second Drovan corridor, as she had calculated it from the terrain. She drew what she saw, she drew what she inferred, she drew the space between them. When she finished, she turned to a new page and started again from a different angle. By the time evening came, the outpost had changed in the small, specific ways that only become visible when you know what you are looking at. Positions had shifted. Equipment had been placed in locations that made no immediate sense, but had a quiet logic when you traced the sight lines. The gap between the two perimeter towers, the one Junho had looked at for too long, now had something in it that had not been there before. Commander Reth walked the perimeter after dark and made note of each change without commenting on any of them. At the center of the outpost, the humans ate. They talked. They were louder than Kethians at rest, louder than Valgorath soldiers off duty, louder than almost any species Reth had hosted in 20 years of garrison command. They laughed at things that were not funny to anyone watching them laugh. They argued about small things, food temperature, who had used whose equipment without asking, the correct way to pack a specific type of case, with a passion that made no sense against the backdrop of what they were here to do. Reth watched from a distance. One of his officers stood beside him. "They don't seem to understand where they are," the officer said. Reth watched Junho move through the group, not commanding, just present, a word here, a nod there, checking something on a map he had folded into quarters and kept in his jacket pocket. He had not raised his voice once since arriving. "No," Reth said. He watched Junho stop at the edge of the firelight and look toward the ridge. The exact ridge. The ridge that Nari had drawn from 6 angles. "They understand exactly where they are." No one took the ration packs. The bet was not formally called. The 4 soldiers who had made it did not speak about it again, but for different reasons. 3 of them were not sure they had really believed it in the first place. The 4th, the one who had given the 6-hour estimate, looked at the assembly in the gap between the towers and thought about what Tiho had built in the storage bay and was privately glad the debt would not be collected. The night was quiet. It did not stay that way. The Droven came before dawn. This was expected. Junho had said the night before that they would come before dawn. He said it the way a person says the weather will turn, not a guess, just a read of available information that had only one reasonable conclusion. Yuna had adjusted the sensor array at 200 hours. Nari was already in position by 300, out past the perimeter in the dark, in the gap between 2 terrain features that appeared on no official map, but appeared on 4 pages of her notebook. At 4:12, the Droven advance hit the first choke point. They had not known it was a choke point. It had not been one when their scouts had mapped this approach 2 days ago. Between then and now, 3 things had changed, none of which were visible from above, and all of which mattered enormously from ground level. The advance slowed. The Droven field commander ordered a push through. The push met resistance from an angle it had not modeled. The field commander called for support on the left flank. The left flank was where Tiho was. The sound the weapon made was not loud. That was the first thing the Droven soldiers near it noticed, that for what it did, it was not loud. The second thing they noticed came after, when the armored Droven unit at the front of the column was simply no longer there in the way it had been before. Not destroyed in the conventional sense. Rearranged, at the molecular level, politely, efficiently, and without any obvious anger. The advance stopped. Not retreated. Stopped, the way something stops when the part of its brain that was processing confidence gets interrupted mid-thought. Junho was on comms. The battle was loud around him, not as loud as it would get, but loud enough that most people would have raised their voice above it. He did not raise his voice. He spoke underneath the noise, flat and specific, calling positions by names that only existed on Nari's hand-drawn map. A rock formation she had called *the shoulder. A low dip in the terrain she had labeled *the bowl. A narrow tree corridor she had marked with 3 small crosses and no explanation. His unit moved to the crosses. The second Droven push came from the east, harder. A flanking column, larger than the first wave, meant to bypass whatever resistance had stalled the advance and come around behind it. This was the correct tactical response to what had happened at the first choke point. It was a good plan. It assumed the humans had not anticipated it. Nari had anticipated it on page 11 of her notebook. The flanking column moved into terrain that should have been open. It was not open. It had been quietly made into something that was the opposite of open over the course of a night, by people who had looked at the terrain with the specific and patient focus of those who intended to use it rather than cross it. The column did not find a wall. It found a maze it had walked into before understanding it was a maze, and by the time that understanding arrived, the options had narrowed considerably. Minyu took a hit at 5:34. He went down. He was down for 6 minutes. During those 6 minutes he remained on comms on his back, completing 2 position updates and flagging a sensor gap that Yuna needed to close before the third wave came. On the 7th minute he stood up. He got back to his position. The Kethian soldier beside him, one of Reth's remaining garrison, assigned to the human unit's right flank, stared at him the way you stare at something that has broken a rule you did not know was a rule. Minyu caught the look. He grinned. The grin that cost him everything, easy and wide and wrong for the moment in every possible way. "I've had worse," he said. He probably had. The Kethian soldier did not respond. He turned back to the field. After a moment, without fully understanding why, he felt slightly better about his own situation. The third wave did not come at the expected time. The Drovan commander was pausing, reassessing. This was unusual. The Drovan were not a species given to long pauses mid-engagement. Their tactical doctrine favored pressure, sustained, rolling pressure that wore resistance down through repetition. But the first 2 waves had produced results that did not map to the doctrine, and a good commander knows when to stop confirming a theory that is failing. The pause lasted 40 minutes. Junho used the 40 minutes. He did not rest. He repositioned. He and Yuna moved 3 elements of the unit to new locations, not defensive locations, not places from which you hold a line, but places from which you reach forward. When the Drovan scouts came to map the human positions during the pause, they found the positions already gone and could not determine where the humans had moved to. This bothered the scouts more than the weapons had. On the Drovan command vessel, positioned 8 kilometers behind the engagement zone, Warlord Graken received the reports. He sat very still as he read them. Graken was an old soldier. He had fought in 11 campaigns across 4 sectors. He had a scar along his jaw from a Valgorath engagement 40 years ago, and he had kept it unrepaired because he felt scars were information. His junior officers sometimes found this philosophy unsettling. He found their squeamishness impractical. He read the first report. He read the second. He called up the human species file on his console, the Council's standard taxonomy, the same file that had been displayed for laughs in the Council chamber, and he read the relevant entries while the third report came in. No natural armor, no regenerative capacity, bone density at critical fragility threshold. The third report said, they do not retreat when losses are sustained. He read the human file again. The fourth report arrived. They are using the terrain as though they built it. The fifth, Warlord, the flanking column is contained. We cannot determine the method. Graken set the file down. He looked at his tactical display. The Keth 7 corridor was shown in 3 colors: zones held, zones contested, zones lost. In 11 days of engagement, the color distribution had moved steadily and predictably in one direction. In the last 6 hours, it had stopped moving. He ordered a second flanking attempt, larger, from the northern approach. He watched the result come back in real time on the display. The northern approach was where Nari was. She had been in the field since the first shot. Nobody had told her to go. Nobody had told her not to. She had her notebook in one pocket, and she was doing the same thing she did at the perimeter the night before, reading terrain, moving through it like someone who has studied a text for so long that they have stopped reading and started thinking in the language. The northern flanking column found every path they tried narrowing around them, not through any single obstacle, but through a sequence of small, specific, invisible decisions made by one person with a pen and a very patient eye. The column stopped advancing. Graken stared at his display. He called for the engagement summary from his field commanders. It arrived in fragments, which was itself unusual. The Droven communication structure was not built for fragmented reports, because fragmented reports meant the situation on the ground was too complicated to summarize cleanly, which meant things had not gone as modeled. One field commander's report ended with a single line that the translator rendered without difficulty, because the syntax was simple and the meaning was precise. These things do not fight like prey. Graken read it twice. He did not order a third wave. Not yet. He sat in his command chair and looked at the display and thought about the 11 days that had come before this day and how differently this one had gone, and he tried to find the variable he had failed to account for. He could not find it in any field of the human species file. He kept looking anyway. The council chamber was not built for silence. It was built for argument, for the overlapping noise of 231 species deciding things together, for the constant mechanical hum of atmospheric processors keeping 19 different breathing environments stable. Silence was not a state the room had been designed to handle. When it arrived now total flat, the kind that presses against the walls, it felt wrong in the way that a stopped clock feels wrong. Not empty, interrupted. On the main display, the live feed from Keth 7 ran without commentary. It had been running for 3 hours. Veldorn had not moved in 40 minutes. It sat at the head of the chamber with 5 limbs folded and 2 resting on the table, and it watched the display with the specific stillness of a being whose internal calculations had been running for a long time without producing a satisfying output. The room watched with it. Nobody spoke. Nobody had spoken for 11 minutes, since the last tactical update had arrived, and the silence had grown from an absence of words into something with its own weight. On the feed, the Keth 7 corridor map, updated in real time, zones shown in color. 36 hours ago, the color distribution had told a clear and simple story, the kind of story that only goes in one direction, the kind the council had been reading for 11 days. Now the map told a different story. The line had stopped moving. Then it had moved the other way. Not far, not fast, but the direction was a fact, and facts in a council chamber have a way of becoming the only thing in the room regardless of how many species are also in it. Delegate Sareth spoke first. Its skin was doing something Bor had not seen it do before, not blue, not the distressed darker blue of the session 12 days ago, but a pale and uncertain color that sat between blue and white like it had not decided yet what it meant. Sareth asked for the casualty figures. An aide provided them. Sareth looked at the numbers. Human losses, significant, Droven losses, far beyond what any model had projected for this engagement type with this force size against this opponent. The ratio was not possible by any model the council used. Sareth asked for the figures again. They were the same. The junior Valgorath delegate who had read the human species file aloud 12 days ago, the same one that had produced the laughter, sat in the second tier and looked at the display without expression. Or rather, with an expression that had started as one thing and was in the process of slowly becoming something else, the way ice becomes water, the transition visible only if you watch long enough. Veldorn looked at the human observation tier. Dehyun was already standing. He had not been asked to stand. He had not raised his hand or requested the floor through the usual channels. He simply stood, and Veldorn, after a moment, gestured for him to speak, and the gesture was different from the one 12 days ago, smaller, less ceremonial. The gesture of a being that is no longer granting a courtesy, but actually listening. Dehyun did not have notes. He looked at the room the way he had looked at it 12 days ago, at the 231 delegates who breathed different things and saw with different structures, and measured the universe through the specific instruments their own evolution had provided. He spoke plainly, without drama, without the careful diplomatic wrapping he had spent a career learning to apply to every difficult sentence. Humans evolved on a planet that was actively trying to kill us for 200,000 years. We didn't develop armor. We didn't develop venom. We didn't develop regeneration or psionic capacity or any of the other things your taxonomy uses to measure threat. He paused, not for effect, because the next part was the real part and he wanted to give it its own space. We developed something else. He sat back down. The room waited for the rest of the sentence. The rest of the sentence did not come. Bora looked at her tablet. She had written every word. She looked at the blank space after asterisk something else, and she did not fill it in, because Dehyun had not filled it in, and she had worked for him long enough to know that the blank space was the point. Every delegate in the room was now sitting with that blank space. Every species in that chamber was running its own answer through its own framework, arriving at its own version of what the word could mean, and every version was correct, and every version was also not quite enough. And that gap, between what the word pointed at and what any framework could fully contain, was the most accurate description that existed. Bora set her pen down. She did not pick it up again for a long time. On the display, the Keth 7 corridor map updated. A sector that had been contested for 9 days turned gold. The color shift was small on the map. In physical terms, it represented terrain that 4,000 people had been sent to lose and had decided, without council authorization and without any tactical support, to take instead. In Warlord Graken's command vessel, orders went out. The full withdrawal from Keth 7 was called at 11:47 standard hours. The command reached the Droven forward units. Several of them had already begun pulling back before the order arrived, not in panic, but in the specific and disciplined retreat of soldiers who have correctly assessed that the situation requires it. Graken watched the withdrawal unfold on his own tactical display. He was methodical about it. He logged each unit's status. He maintained command structure through the full extraction. When it was complete, he sat in his chair for a moment. He pulled up the human species file. He had read it several times now. The entry fields were still the same: no natural armor, no regenerative capacity, pain tolerance, moderate, threat assessment ranking, 217th. The language of the assessment was professional, measured, based on solid taxonomic data gathered through legitimate observation. Every entry was accurate. None of them had produced a useful prediction. He deleted the file from his personal archive, not with frustration, not with anger, with the quiet, specific embarrassment of an experienced professional who has made a fundamental error in method and knows it precisely enough to name it. The error was not in the data. The data was correct. The error was in what he had assumed the data could tell him. He filed the campaign report. He opened the section he would later label what we misunderstood, and he began to write, and it became the longest section in the document. In the council chamber, the display continued updating. Sector by sector, the color shifted. The map was changing, the simple visual language of military geography rewriting itself in real time, and the chamber watched it happen in a silence that had stopped feeling like an interruption and started feeling like a conclusion being reached by 231 very different minds all at once. Veldorn looked at the human species file, still open in one corner of the display. Threat assessment, negligible. It looked at it for a long time. Nobody laughed. Not because the room had become solemn or because some declaration of respect had been made. Just because the math was on the display, and the math had a tone to it, and the tone did not leave room for laughing. Dehyun looked at the display too. He did not look satisfied. He did not look vindicated. He looked like a man who has been carrying something heavy for a very long time and has not yet put it down, because he knows from experience that the moment you put it down, someone will ask you to pick it up again, and the second time is always worse. Bora watched him. She turned to a new page in her tablet. She wrote the date at the top, and below it she wrote the word asterisk something, and below that she wrote asterisk else, and then she left the rest of the page empty. The feed ran on. The map kept changing. The corridor was almost entirely gold now. The chamber stayed quiet. It was a different kind of quiet than the one the room had been built to interrupt. This one nobody wanted to break. The transport home smelled like recycled air and old coffee and something metallic that nobody could locate the source of. Nobody looked very hard. The ship was theirs, which meant the smell was theirs, which meant it was fine. Minyu slept for 14 hours in the second rack from the floor, one arm over his face, his boots still on. When he woke up, he ate a full meal, then most of another one, then fell asleep again for 4 more hours. Nobody commented on this. It was a known quantity. Minyu burned through everything he had in the field and then rebuilt it at the table, and the process required volume and time, and those who had been in the field with him more than once simply planned around it. Tiho cleaned his equipment, all of it, slowly, with the same careful hands that had assembled it in the storage bay at Keth 7. He did not rush any step. Some of the pieces did not technically need what he was doing to them, but he did it anyway because the doing of it was its own thing, separate from the need for it. Yuna sat by one of the small porthole windows and looked at the dark between stars for a long time. She said something, low and quiet, not directed at anyone in particular. A Kethian soldier, one of Reth's people, riding the transport back at the garrison's request for logistical reasons, was close enough to hear it. He did not understand the language. He asked his translation unit what she had said. The translation unit gave him the literal meaning of the words. He sat with it for the rest of the journey home. He would sit with it for longer than that. What she said was not recorded. Nari started a new notebook before the transport had cleared the Keth 7 system. She drew the outpost from memory, not as it had looked on the first day, but as it had looked on the last, every change they had made to it, every position and assembly and small decision that had accumulated across the days into something larger than any of its pieces. She drew it the way an architect draws something after the building is finished, not for planning, for knowing. Junho stood near the back of the main compartment and said very little, which was normal, and ate his meals, which were small, which was also normal. And at some point during the second day of travel, he went to the quiet end of the ship and sat alone for an hour, and nobody followed him there, because people who had worked with him knew what the hour was for. When he came back, he looked the same as before. He always looked the same as before. The formal council session was convened 11 days after the Keth 7 corridor was officially reclassified as secured. The chamber was full. This was also unusual. Sessions dealing with post-engagement taxonomy updates did not typically draw full attendance. Today, every seat in the chamber was occupied. The atmospheric processors worked harder than usual. The room breathed. Veldorn chaired. The agenda had one item. The human species file was displayed on the main screen. Full entry. Every field. The same document that had been read aloud 12 days before the human force deployed in this same room to this same chamber of delegates and had produced laughter. Bora stood at the lectern, because the protocol for formal record amendment required the relevant observer delegation's aide to read the existing record aloud before any changes were entered. Dehyun had told her 2 days ago that she would be doing this. She had not said anything in response. She had just looked at him for a moment and then looked away. She read the file from the beginning, every entry, the atmospheric classification, the biological threat assessment, the physical capability metrics, no natural armor, no regenerative capacity, bone density at critical fragility threshold, pain tolerance, moderate, threat potential, negligible. She read each line in the flat and neutral voice that official record reading required. She did not editorialize. She did not pause longer on any one line than any other. She read it the way you read something that got it wrong. The chamber listened. When she finished, she stepped back from the lectern and returned to her seat and folded her hands in her lap and looked at the middle distance, at nothing specific, with the expression of someone who has completed a necessary task and is waiting for the room to catch up. Delegate Sareth moved to open the amendment session. The methodology discussion that followed lasted 4 hours. This was the part nobody outside the chamber would ever fully understand, because it was not about the data. The data was easy. The data was wrong in ways that could be corrected by updating numbers, adjusting rankings, reclassifying physical threat fields. That part took 40 minutes. The part that took 4 hours was the part underneath the data, the question of what category you put a species in when the category you had built for them was based on the wrong question. Threat ranking in the Council's taxonomy was built on physical biology, armor, venom, regeneration, size, and structural density. The framework had existed for over 1,000 years and had been applied to 4,000 species and had worked, in the sense that it had produced a reliable order of what species posed what level of physical danger to other species in close contact. It was a good system. It was a thorough system. It had simply measured the wrong thing, in the case of one particular species, because the danger was not located in the body. Nobody could agree on what to call the category. They debated for 2 hours on the language alone. Sareth proposed one formulation. A Valgorath senior delegate countered with another. 3 more came from the outer tiers. Each one tried to name something that kept shifting when you looked at it directly. The specific capacity that had made 4,200 humans hold a corridor that 12 allied species had surrendered in 11 days. Dehyun was asked for input on the language. He read the proposed formulations one by one. He nodded at the last one, not enthusiastically, not with the satisfaction of someone whose suggestion was taken, but with the nod of a person accepting a reasonable approximation of something that does not yet have a precise name. He did not tell them the word they chose was still not quite right. He filed it away. That was his job. You filed things away and you waited. In his experience, the galaxy caught up eventually. Not quickly, but eventually. Graken's campaign debrief reached Council intelligence 2 days after the session. The full document, 37 pages. The section titled What We Misunderstood was 14 pages long. The final paragraph of that section was the one that got passed between Council intelligence analysts for weeks afterward. It said, with the blunt precision of an old soldier who has decided there is no point in being indirect about failure. We assumed fear was universal. We assumed that a species which could feel pain and could die would, at some point, decide that the pain and dying were sufficient reasons to stop. We were wrong. We do not yet have a model that accounts for a species that treats both of those things as variables to be managed, rather than limits to be respected. We recommend that no Drovan force engage human units again until such a model exists. The model did not exist yet. It would take a long time. Junho was home 6 days after the session. Not a ceremony, not an arrival event. He came back to his city the way he had left it, without announcement, without ceremony, in the ordinary way that ordinary travel ends, which is that you are somewhere and then you are somewhere else. He took the train from the spaceport. He walked the last 8 blocks. He let himself into his apartment and set his bag down, and stood in the middle of the room for a moment in the particular stillness of someone who has been somewhere large and difficult, and is now somewhere small and quiet, and needs a moment for the two things to reconcile. He made tea. He sat at his table by the window. The city was outside, his city, the one he had grown up in and left many times and kept returning to, the way a particular kind of person returns to a particular kind of place, because it is the correct place for them to be when they are not needed somewhere else. It was morning, an ordinary morning. The kind that has no awareness of anything that has happened, that simply runs its usual sequence of light and sound and movement, because that is what mornings do. He pulled the small device from his coat pocket. The live feed connected after a moment. The council chamber was in session, a different agenda, but the main display had the human file still up in one corner as reference material for something being discussed. The threat assessment field had been updated. Junho looked at it. He drank his tea. Outside, the city moved through its morning. A delivery vehicle, two people talking at the corner, a bird on the railing of the building across the street, doing nothing in particular, simply being where it was. He did not say anything. He finished his tea and set the cup down and closed the feed, and sat at his table in his city on his ordinary morning. And outside the window the light came in the way it always had, like none of it had happened, like all of it had. Both things were true. He let them be.